Well, I'm Senator Dick Black, State Senator of Virginia. I have a long military history, fought with the 1st Marine Regiment in Vietnam and also flew helicopters on quite a number of missions. So I'm very pro-military, but at the same time I have very deep reservations about what we're doing in Syria. So I'd like to talk with you. Welcome to the Schiller conference, and I'd like to just give you a rundown on where we stand today and kind of how we got there. Syria is the essential nation in the Middle East because everything revolves around Syria. And you can see where it's placed. Turkey runs across the northern border of both Syria and Iraq, and the Mediterranean Ocean is out here, so that Syria actually has access to the Mediterranean. Israel is down in this area. Lebanon is here. Jordan here. We have a history with Syria that goes back. Many people think that the Arab Spring was sort of a spontaneous thing. If you think of it, it started with one suicide in Tunisia. Well, I will tell you that Tunisia supplies more fighters to ISIS than any other nation on earth, which is sort of interesting. And the fact is that one suicide did not cause the Arab Spring. I will guarantee you that. Now I'm going to focus though on Syria because again, Syria is central to everything in the Middle East. And this is a brief countdown to the Syrian War, and there are things that preceded it, obviously. But I wanted to start with 2001 because we have clear testimony from General Wesley Clark, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, NATO. That's our top combatant commander worldwide. So he was in the key position for an American general outside of the Pentagon. He relates, and you can find this easily by Googling Wesley Clark and 2001. In 2001, the Pentagon started war planning to topple the Syrian government. Wesley Clark said that after the 9/11 attacks, he was in the Pentagon, visited with the Secretary of Defense, and then he went and he spoke with a friend of his who was a general, and the general said, boss, he said, you got to look at this. He said, what is it? He said, we're going to attack Iraq. And General Clark said, why? He says, have we found something on weapons of mass destruction? The general said, no. He said, it looks like we just figured we've got a great military and we got a problem and we're going to do something with it. About a month later, General Clark goes back in and he looks up this same general. He says, is this still on? Are we still going to attack Iraq? And the general said, hey, it's worse than that. And he pulled up a sheet of paper. He says, we've got plans now to topple seven governments in the Middle East. Now, one of them was Syria. One of them also was Libya, which ties in with Syria. So I want to discuss both. But in any event, the war planning clearly had begun in 2001. Now, what's important about 2001? Well, the Syrian War did not begin until 10 years later. There were no uprisings in Syria. The Syrians were prosperous. It was one of the most prosperous nations in the Middle East, one of the most advanced. Syria had the greatest women's rights and the greatest religious freedom of any of the Arab nations. Think about that. Here we've demonized Syria, and yet they were the nation that had genuine freedom relative to all of the other Arab nations. So we begin war planning in 2001. WikiLeaks did a tremendous service, I think, to all of us when they released some of the diplomatic communiques out of the Syrian embassy. A communique from the U.S. Embassy in 2006 described a detailed plan for destabilizing and undermining the Syrian government. There are certain things that were very crucial and very interesting in their layout. They said one of the problems is that there is so much foreign investment coming in, flooding into Syria, because there was a feeling that President Assad was a reformer, and in fact he had put in place a number of reforms, and there was just tremendous hope that Syria was going to be very prosperous. So one thing they said is, look, we've got to create conditions that will undermine investors' confidence in Syria so that we can undermine the economy of Syria. Probably more important even than that is the fact that the U.S. Embassy in Damascus identified the fact that Syria, it had this rather unique and rather beautiful religious culture. It had Christians, Druze, Yazidis, Kurds, it had the Sunnis, it had Shiites, and because of this diversity of religious background, there had developed this culture of sort of live and let live. Now, it was constantly undermined by the Muslim Brotherhood. Under President Assad's father, Assad, there had been a violent rebellion triggered by the Muslim Brotherhood. But in any event, 2006, the United States Embassy plans the overthrow of Syria. There were no uprisings, there were no demonstrations. But here we were planning the uprising, and we had started the war plans 5 years earlier. The year 2011 becomes a very terrible year in Mideast history. This is when the so-called Arab Spring starts in Tunisia, and then all of a sudden unrest spontaneously occurs in so many countries, as it often does when covert operatives go to work. The United States, Britain, France took the lead, working together with Turkey and with Qatar, and we promoted the Libyan uprising. Now, why did we do this? Colonel Gaddafi had become the principal ally of the United States in the war on terror in North Africa. We had had our problems with him, to be sure, but they had been settled. We'd normalized relations. We went in there, and with the great help of Senator John McCain, we declared that there would be a no-fly zone. Now, a no-fly zone is a strange name for a free-fire zone, but that's what it is. It's a free-fire zone where you go in and you literally bomb everything to smithereens. That's what we did. By the time that we were finished in Libya, there essentially was no government, there was no culture, there was nothing. Everything was destroyed, except for the Libyan arms supplies. Colonel Gaddafi had a vast supply of modern arms. The purpose in overthrowing Libya was to be able to take these advanced weapons from Libya, send them through Turkey into Syria to overthrow Syria. And this was their way of getting around having to go to Congress for appropriations and to say, hey, look, Congress, let's go in and let's attack an allied nation, a neutral, non-belligerent country, and murder its leader. What do you think? I don't think they'd have gotten very far. It's much easier to simply stage a covert operation. And so that's what happened there. The war in Libya is very interesting because using the plans that the U.S. Embassy had outlined 5 years earlier, covert operatives from the United States, Britain, France, and now Turkey, Saudi Arabia, worked together with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood began to promote sectarian tensions. And they would go in various cities where there were heavy Christian populations, and they would mark all of the Christian homes with the Nazarene symbol, which is sort of a pejorative symbol in the Arab world. They had people standing on street corners with posters that said, Alawites or Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. Now, the Alawites are a major sort of Shiite-oriented religious group, and they are sort of the dominant group in Syria. So these peaceful demonstrators wanted to murder all of the Alawites, and they wanted to purge Syria of all of the Christians. And on order, they did just that, and they began rising up in cities, and they would come out of the mosques and go storming through the streets, beating people up. In the city of Hama, 70,000 Christians were driven with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They left homes, businesses, vehicles, everything, driven out. And where did they go? Did they go to the rebel-held areas? No. They went to Damascus because they knew that President Assad would defend the Christians just as his father had done previously. This is the outline of where we were, how we got there. So the Syrian War is often presented as a domestic uprising, an uprising of people who wanted freedom and democracy. A Defense Intelligence Agency study that was commissioned by the Joint Chiefs of Staff determined that this is essentially a myth, this idea of moderate rebels. It has always been a myth. Even at the very beginning, Senator John McCain traveled to Syria to disprove this idea that there were terrorists among the rebels. He took some photos, and it turned out people were able to circle individuals who were known terrorists. And so even though he was trying to disprove it, his actions actually proved that the Syrian rebels were heavily infiltrated and controlled by the terrorists from the very beginning. Now, what I'd like to do is go beyond that. It's interesting that there have been a number of people who have come out and identified the source of the terror. Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, got in real hot water when he made a statement, and he said that we've got a real problem because it's Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey that's funding ISIS. There are communiques from Hillary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State, where she said, we've got a problem with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey. There are numerous statements from high government officials subtly acknowledging that this is a big problem. So what I'd like to do now is to focus a little bit more on the current situation today. Now, if you go back to early in 2015, what had happened is the Turks and the Saudis had teamed up and they had formed something called the Army of Conquest. The Army of Conquest was based and centered around al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and Al-Qaeda, you'll recall, is the group that killed 3,000 Americans when they attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on 9/11. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia put together this army of conquest based on the very people who carried out the greatest attack ever on the American homeland. And so much of this comes out of Turkey. Now, Saudi Arabia geographically is not as well positioned to provide things other than financial assistance and jihadis. Many jihadis come from Saudi Arabia, and they're part of the invading force coming into Syria. Many of the rebels that fight in Syria are not recruited from among the Syrians. They come from Tunisia, they come from Saudi Arabia, they come from 60 different Muslim countries. Now, going back to our original map, Turkey runs along the northern border of both Syria and Iraq. Now, what this map shows you here, the green portions are now controlled by the Kurds. You recall the heroic battle at Kobani, where the Kurds fought against tremendous odds against ISIS, and finally the American people were so inspired by it that it forced the government to genuinely start bombing, not just to, occasionally run some planes out and bring them back with their bomb loads, but actually to bomb in support of the Kurds. Now, I have spoken to Kurds who were present on the Turkish side of the border. The Turkish army had protected the border with tanks. They put 50 tanks. During the Battle of Kobani, the Turks brought convoys of Red Crescent ambulances, which is like the Red Cross in the Middle East, and they loaded them with ISIS jihadis, and they used the ambulances, which the Kurds obviously would not fire on, and they used them to carry ammunition and fresh troops into battle for ISIS. So this was going on. Well, what happened is the Kurds finally managed to get the best of ISIS. They conquered ISIS, and rather than simply securing Kobani, they began to attack. And they began to move all the way across the border, and they began to seal it and to cut off access to Turkey. You can see there's another piece of Kurdish-held territory there. Now, what this did is it threatened to totally block access from ISIS. Now, ISIS is the number one ally of ISIS is Turkey. Turkey provides them with all of the arms, with all the ammunition, with hospitals to treat their wounded. They have regular routes where jihadists come in from all over the world who are recruited. They pay various rebels, both in Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, Turkey supplies the Army of Conquest, which is Al-Qaeda based, through this gap over here, which they have opened up. And but this Kobani gap is where ISIS is supplied. Now, if you look at the gray area is held by ISIS. And so you can see this is Raqqa. Raqqa is the known capital of ISIS. Now, the irony is that the United States, when it formed this big coalition that was supposedly going to conquer ISIS, this is the first war we have ever fought where the enemy's capital was essentially off limits. We did a couple of little bombing runs. In fact, one of them, it looked for a moment like we were changing our policy. The Kurds were making a drive on Raqqa, and we went in and we bombed all of the bridges so that the Kurds would not be able to enter Raqqa. So there was this subtle understanding that there were certain places that were off limits for the coalition. So this is the capital. It's fully operational today. The United States, I think, is beginning to shift its policy. I think Raqqa's days are numbered, but it's still a long ways off. The area of Deir al-Zor is a major oil-producing area that is controlled by Raqqa. ISIS has 1,200, or they did have 1,200 oil tankers that were running oil through the Kobani Gap. 44,000 barrels of oil a day were transiting through there, and unlike the typical border controls that Turkey has over things flowing through, they waved the oil through. They knew what that was, and they knew where it was going. And it was going on the market, and they paid good money to ISIS. This was probably the major single source of financing for ISIS. But it wasn't the only one. The ISIS terrorists captured the wonderful, beautiful city of Palmyra, which was one of the architectural treasures of the world. They began to loot, and the looted material was sent up through the Kobani Gap and then marketed in Turkey. Additionally, in Mosul, in Iraq, where the ISIS troops had seized, this is a city of 1 million, and so they had seized major hospitals, and they forced the doctors to do live removal of human body parts, and they would be packed in ice and shipped again through the Kobani Gap and sold on the market through Turkey and also through Saudi Arabia. A tremendous amount of money in live body parts, because they could literally select the size. If you had a child, you could get a child's organs. There were various reports of Iraqi doctors who were beheaded for refusing. They simply refused to open up live children and extract their organs. But this is the type of trade that our good allies, our NATO allies, Turkey. Turkey is essentially an organized criminal enterprise. This is how they function. This is how they fund themselves. The president of Turkey, President Erdogan, has now won total control of the parliament, and they're going to rewrite the constitution. He has declared that he wants powers similar to those of Adolf Hitler. We are now fighting alongside, in a coalition, with a man who says that he wants the powers of Adolf Hitler. So we've ended up in this strange situation, which I think goes back to the days when we were reliant on Mideast oil. Those days are gone. We can now produce all of the oil that we could possibly use, and we probably could supply most of the world with oil. But we're stuck in this old way of thinking, and so as we negotiate for peace in Syria today, we have a spider on one side and a scorpion on the other, and those are Turkey and Saudi Arabia, two of the most vile dictatorships in the world. The Turks have a long history of murdering Christians in the Armenian genocide. They're now killing off Kurds within Turkey. The Kurds are about 20% of the Turkish population. We have Saudi Arabia, which has absolutely no freedom whatsoever. Women are viewed as total property, and there still is slavery that goes on. They officially abolished slavery in 1962, but it still goes on to some extent, even to this day. So those are our grand allies, the ones that we think we should rely on to improve Syria. The orange area is the area that is controlled by the Syrian government. You will notice that there is an arrow showing Al-Qaeda rebels coming in from the south out of Jordan. Through the CIA, we have trained 200 terrorists each month to invade from Jordan. That is beginning to subside, and I think part of it is that the Department of Defense has never been comfortable with our policies relative to Syria. They recognize that Syria is the place that is absolutely essential for Al-Qaeda and ISIS to take over in order to use it as a springboard into Europe. So this is where we stand right now. Now, it looked last year as though the army of conquest and ISIS would simply collapse the Syrian government. They had fought for 5 years, fought very valiantly against all of the forces of the world, the Western world, NATO, EU, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the whole thing. They were fighting everybody, and yet they had held on for 5 years. And in 5 years, not a single rebel ever became a popular figure among the Syrian people. Amazing, in 5 years. And but they were beginning to fall back. The Turks were driving Al-Qaeda into, they took over Idlib, which is a major city, and were headed towards Damascus. They were coming up out of Jordan towards Damascus. And then the Russians, in what can only be described as an absolutely heroic act on the part of President Putin, moved in with a relatively modest military force. There's little discussion in the media about the size of this, but you're talking about perhaps 4 squadrons of aircraft. They may have peaked out somewhere around 120 aircraft, and a force of perhaps 5,000–6,000 people. Relatively small force, and yet, because they're not constrained by all of these crazy rules of engagement that we apply to our forces, we apply them because of the pressures brought by Turkey and brought by Saudi Arabia. And so we avoided attacking the oil supply going into Turkey and things like that. And so the Russians came in and they said, we're not going to do that game. We're in here, we're going to do it for real. They attacked the oil supply. They began driving back the army of conquest and shrinking them in this area. They began bombing around Aleppo, the major industrial center of Syria, and there were some major advances made there. Everywhere, the rebels, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, are falling back on every single front throughout the country. Now I'll shift just a minute to the area of Aleppo. Aleppo, again, the major city of outside of the capital in Damascus, a great industrial center. When it was first taken over by the rebels, one of the first things that Turkey had them do is to strip all of the factories. 1,000 Syrian factories were looted, and all of the machinery was shipped up to Turkey. Turkey, again, it acts as an organized criminal enterprise, basically feeding off of its neighbor. What the Russians did, and by this time there's strong indications that the Department of Defense, the United States and Russia began cooperating on what was going on. And the Syrians had struggled and struggled. This white area on this map is the area held by the rebels. The orange area is the area that's held by the government. And you can see the government fought and expanded its way down south. And then it did two things that were very unexpected. One is, instead of fighting and fighting to close this gap, the Tiger Division fought its way and liberated the Khawaris airfield, where ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they had shifted positions, but they had planned to take 2,000 Syrian troops and behead them, and they had laid siege to this for several years. With Russian help, the Syrians were able to liberate Khawaris Air Base, and then they hooked back, and they very nearly captured a large pocket of ISIS troops here. Most of them slipped out in the end, but in any event, all of this area is now under Syrian government control. Up in the north, this is where the rebels were supplied out of Turkey. There was an area where they would come through, and all of Aleppo was fed, all of the rebel activity was fed out of Turkey. And suddenly, instead of trying to close this gap, they drove across here and they linked up with the Kurds, and there was a pocket of Shiites, two large cities, Nubal and Zara, and those two pockets were liberated, and they began fighting on the side of the Syrian army, and both the army and the Kurds moved up here and closed this gap, and now the rebels in Aleppo are in a very tenuous position where they have almost been cut off completely from their sources of supply. So in summary, I would simply say, what would end this war? To counteract what the Russians were doing to assist the Syrian government and the tremendous actions by the Syrian army, which it is helped by Iran, and it is helped by Hezbollah forces out of Lebanon. In order to counter that, the State Department, CIA, White House triangle made sure that anti-tank missiles were provided indirectly to the rebel forces, both to ISIS and to Al-Qaeda. They are supplied with American anti-tank missiles and anti-tank missiles from American allies. You can be certain that ISIS does not have the sophistication to produce its own anti-tank missiles, but we have the means of making sure they get what they need. If we want this war to end, and it is essential to American vital interests in the Middle East that Syria survive and that the terrorists be defeated, the way to do it is to cut off the TOW anti-tank missiles that we're continuing to send in, and we're allowing the Saudi Arabians and the Turks to send in. We must restore peace to the Middle East. Syria is the key to doing it. When this war ends, this tremendous wave of jihadist activity across the globe will begin to subside. And it's going to be essential that, as it does, we start putting the thumb on Saudi Arabia, which is exporting this Wahhabist, poisonous breed of Islamic radicalism, which is causing literally thousands of attacks across the globe monthly, on a monthly basis. It's a remarkable number, and so we've got to stop the terrorism, and the place to start is in Syria. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you enjoy the Schiller Conference.